The cottage doorway stood open to the evening air, and Rosalind Thorne's hand rested on the frame where she had steadied herself 100 times before. She had said goodbye to the village that afternoon, to the blacksmith's wife who wept, to the grocer who pressed a parcel of tea into her hands, to the children who followed her down the lane, asking when she would return. The cart would come at dawn to carry her belongings to Thornfield, and with them, the life she had built here in 6 careful months. She opened the door for one last look at the herb garden she had planted in spring, and there on the gravel path stood Sebastian Ashmore, Duke of Hartwell, at an hour he had never come before. The man who had not spoken a single word in 7 years was watching her with an expression she could not name. And when she told him the cart came tomorrow, he said nothing at all. She turned to go inside, her throat tight with all the things she would not say to a man who could not answer. Behind her, a voice she had never heard, low, rough, and certain, spoke into the silence. He said, "Ask me why." But that was not how it began. 4 months earlier, the herb garden had worn frost like lace across the stone path, and Rosalind had been cutting rosemary in the pale light of dawn. She heard footsteps on the gravel, the same footsteps she had heard every morning for 3 months, passing her cottage on the way to the North Fields. The Duke of Hartwell walked the estate at first light, a tall figure in a dark greatcoat, who nodded to her once and continued on his way. He had never stopped. He had never spoken. The entire county knew the story. 7 years ago, a fever had struck him mute. He managed the estate through written notes delivered by his steward, attended church but did not sing, and lived a life of silence that the village had long since accepted as permanent. That morning, the footsteps stopped. Rosalind looked up from the rosemary, the pruning knife still in her hand, and found Sebastian Ashmore standing at the edge of her garden with a slate in his hands. He was perhaps 34, lean and composed, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that held the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to communicate without sound. He held the slate toward her. On it, written in precise script, were the words, "The yarrow on the north slope is ready. I can show you." She set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron. She asked, "You're certain it's ready? The frost came early this year. I thought it would need another week." He turned the slate and wrote quickly, "I checked yesterday. The leaves are still green. If you wait, the rain will spoil them." Rosalind studied him for a moment. She had treated half the tenants on this estate for coughs, fevers, and broken bones, but the Duke himself had never approached her directly. His mother, Lady Ashmore, had visited once to welcome her and to explain, with careful delicacy, that His Grace had lost his voice to illness and communicated through writing. The fever story had been repeated so many times, it had the smooth polish of truth. She said, "All right, I'll fetch my basket." She went inside and returned with a wicker gathering basket and a pair of gloves. Sebastian was waiting on the path, his hands folded behind his back. He gestured toward the north slope, and they walked in silence through the morning mist. The north slope was a 15-minute walk from her cottage, past the tenant farms and through a stand of oak trees that still held their leaves despite the frost. The ground was uneven, rutted from the autumn rains, and Rosalind kept her eyes on the path. She had walked these fields alone for months, learning the estate's geography through her work. She knew where the chamomile grew wild, where the tenants gathered nettles, where the blackthorn bloomed in spring, but she had never been to the north slope. It was too far from the village for casual foraging, and she had not yet needed yarrow in quantities large enough to justify the walk. Sebastian walked ahead of her, his stride long and sure. He did not look back to see if she followed. He simply assumed she would, and she did. The yarrow grew in a wide patch along the slope's eastern edge. The white flowers long gone, but the leaves still green and pungent. Rosalind knelt and began cutting the stems, working quickly with practiced hands. Sebastian stood a few paces away, watching the horizon. After a moment, he knelt beside her and began gathering the cut stems into neat bundles. She glanced at him and said, "You don't have to help." He picked up the slate, which he had brought with him, and wrote. "I know." They worked in silence for 20 minutes. The sun rose higher, burning off the mist, and the air warmed enough that Rosalind pushed back her shawl. When the basket was full, she stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt. Sebastian stood as well, and as she turned to start down the slope, her boot caught on a loose stone. She stumbled, her weight pitching forward, and his hand caught her elbow. The contact lasted 2 seconds. His grip was firm, steadying her without pulling, and then he released her immediately and stepped back. Rosalind straightened, her face warm, and said, "Thank you." He nodded once and gestured for her to walk ahead of him down the slope. They returned to her cottage in silence. When they reached the gate, Rosalind turned to him and said, "I'm grateful. I wouldn't have known the yarrow was ready." Sebastian inclined his head, then turned and walked back toward the great house. Rosalind watched him go, the basket heavy in her hands, and wondered why a duke who had not spoken in 7 years had taken the trouble to walk her to the north slope and kneel in the dirt to help her harvest herbs. The village of Hartwell was small, prosperous, and wary of strangers. Rosalind had arrived in late spring with a letter of introduction from the apothecary in her previous town, and a reputation for setting bones cleanly. Lady Ashmore had hired her as the estate herbalist after the previous healer. An elderly woman named Mrs. Croft had died in her sleep. The position came with a cottage, a small salary, and the understanding that Rosalind would treat the tenants and staff as needed. She had treated a broken wrist, 3 cases of fever, a dislocated shoulder, and more coughs than she could count. The tenants came to her cottage at all hours, and she turned no one away. She worked from a kitchen table covered in drying herbs, her father's medical texts stacked on a shelf above the hearth, and a still room at the back of the cottage where she compounded remedies and stored her supplies. Her father had been an apothecary in a market town, 2 counties away. He had trained her from the age of 8, teaching her to identify plants, prepare tinctures, and read the old herbals with their woodcut illustrations and crabbed Latin text. She had married at 23, a country surgeon named Daniel Thorne, a serious man who valued her skill and her willingness to assist him in his work. They had been married for 3 years when a fever swept through the town. Daniel had refused to abandon his patients. He had died in the 4th week of the outbreak, and Rosalind had buried him in the churchyard beside the apothecary's shop where they had met. She had left the town 6 months later. The memories were too thick, the streets too narrow, and everywhere she looked, she saw the shadow of the man who had loved her work before he loved her. She had never been certain the order reversed. Hartwell was far enough away that no one knew her story unless she chose to tell it. She did not choose to tell it. 3 weeks after the walk to the north slope, Sebastian appeared at her cottage door with a fox in his arms. Rosalind opened the door to find him standing on the threshold, his coat dusty and his expression carefully neutral. The fox was young, perhaps 6 months old, and its left hind leg was bent at an unnatural angle. It was wrapped in a piece of sacking, and Sebastian held it with the same steady care he had used to catch her elbow on the slope. He held out a slate with his free hand. On it, found on the east road, "Leg broken. Can you set it?" Rosalind stepped back and gestured him inside. She said, "Bring it to the table." She cleared the table of the yarrow she had been bundling and spread a clean cloth across the surface. Sebastian laid the fox down gently and stepped back. The animal's eyes were wide with fear, its breathing rapid, but it did not struggle. Rosalind examined the leg. The break was clean, just above the hock. She could set it, but the fox would need to be kept still for several days while the bone healed. She said, "I can set it, but it will need to stay here for at least a week. Longer if the leg doesn't heal straight." Sebastian nodded and wrote on the slate, "I will pay for its care." She replied, "You don't need to pay me, but you'll need to bring it food. I don't keep meat here." He wrote, "I will bring it tomorrow." She set the bone while Sebastian held the fox's body still. The animal made a high, keening sound, but it did not bite. When the splint was in place and the leg wrapped, Rosalind placed the fox in a wooden crate lined with straw and set it near the hearth. Sebastian stood by the table, watching. Rosalind washed her hands in the basin and dried them on a towel. When she turned, she expected him to leave. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down. She blinked and asked, "Do you want tea?" He picked up the slate and wrote, "If you are making it." Rosalind put the kettle on and set out 2 cups. They sat at the table in silence while the water boiled. The fox shifted in its crate, and Sebastian glanced toward it, his expression softening in a way that made him look younger. When the tea was ready, Rosalind poured and sat across from him. She said, "Where did you find it?" He wrote, "East Road, near the old mill. I think it was hit by a cart." She asked, "You were walking the East Road?" He nodded. She said, "That's a long way from the North Fields." He wrote, "I walk different routes. I like to see the estate." They drank their tea. Sebastian did not hurry. He sat with his hands folded around the cup, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was comfortable in her kitchen. When the tea was finished, he stood, inclined his head, and left. The next morning, he returned with a bundle of raw meat wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table, checked the fox, and sat down again. Rosalind made tea. They did not speak, but the quiet felt companionable rather than awkward. He came again the following day, and the day after that. On the 4th day, Rosalind received a letter. It arrived by post in the late afternoon, a thick envelope with the seal of the Thornfield estate pressed into red wax. Rosalind opened it at the kitchen table and read the contents twice. The letter was from the steward of Thornfield, a large estate in the neighboring county. They were seeking a head herbalist to manage the stillroom and oversee the health of the tenants. The position came with a house, a generous salary, and the authority to hire an assistant. The letter was formal, courteous, and clearly written by someone who had made inquiries about her work. Rosalind set the letter down and stared at it. She had not applied for the position. Someone must have recommended her. Perhaps the apothecary who had written her letter of introduction, or one of the physicians she had assisted in her previous town. She did not sign the letter. She left it on the table, face up, and returned to bundling the yarrow. The next morning, Sebastian arrived to check the fox. The letter was still on the table. He glanced at it, then at her, but did not write anything. 2 weeks later, he brought a bird. It was a small brown thrush with a broken wing, and he carried it in his hands as carefully as he had carried the fox. Rosalind set the wing and placed the bird in a cage near the window. Sebastian stayed for tea. He sat at the table and watched her work, his slate resting on his knee, unused. The third animal was a hawk. It arrived on a cold morning in October, and this time Sebastian came with a note already written. Found in the West Wood. Wing damaged. I think it was shot. Rosalind examined the hawk's wing and found a small puncture wound, likely from a pellet. She cleaned the wound, applied a poultice, and wrapped the wing. The hawk was larger than the thrush, fiercer, and it watched her with eyes like polished amber. Sebastian sat at the table while she worked. The Thornfield Letter had arrived again, a second copy, sent as a reminder. Rosalind had turned it face down when she saw the seal. She did not want to think about it while Sebastian was present. When the hawk was settled, Rosalind washed her hands and turned to find Sebastian watching her. She set down the towel and said, "You could leave them at the door. I would still treat them." He picked up the slate and wrote, "I know." She asked, "Then why do you stay?" He stared at the slate. His hand hovered over it, chalk poised, and then he wrote a single word and erased it. He wrote again and erased again. After a long moment, he set the chalk down and did not write anything. Rosalind watched him struggle to answer the question both of them understood. The moment stretched between them, and then Sebastian stood, inclined his head, and left. The Thornfield Letter sat on the table, face down, for 3 days. On the 4th day, Rosalind turned it over and read it again. The offer was generous. The position was exactly the kind of work she had trained for. She could build a still room, hire an assistant, and establish herself as the head of a household instead of a cottage herbalist who treated coughs and set bones. She picked up her pen and set it down again. She did not sign the letter. The rain came in late October, heavy and cold, turning the paths to mud and the fields to marshland. Rosalind had been called to a tenant's house to treat a child's fever, and by the time she finished, the rain was falling in sheets. She had no coat, only a shawl, and by the time she was halfway home, she was soaked through. She did not see Sebastian until he was beside her on the path. He did not speak, of course. He simply removed his coat and placed it over her shoulders without touching her. The coat was heavy, warm, and smelled of leather and wood smoke and 7 years of silence. Rosalind pulled it close and looked up at him, but he was already walking ahead, his shirt plastering to his shoulders in the rain. When they reached her cottage, he did not come inside. He simply nodded and walked back toward the great house, coatless in the rain. Rosalind stood in the doorway and watched him go. She kept the coat until the next morning, when she folded it carefully and left it on the bench outside her door. By the time she returned from her morning work, it was gone. A week later, she treated a cut on his hand. He had reached into the herb garden without gloves and caught his palm on a blackthorn stem. The cut was deep, running across the base of his thumb, and when he arrived at her cottage, the blood had soaked through the handkerchief he had wrapped around it. Rosalind sat him down at the table and unwrapped the handkerchief. She cleaned the wound with water and a tincture of calendula, then threaded a needle to stitch the edges together. Sebastian watched her work without flinching. She held his palm open in both hands, the needle poised, and said, "This will hurt." He nodded. She stitched the wound in 5 careful passes, and when it was finished, she wrapped his hand in clean linen. But before she released him, her thumb traced past the cut along the line of his hand, the long, steady line that ran from his wrist to the base of his fingers. She held his hand longer than necessary, her thumb resting against his pulse, and when she finally let go, his fingers curled slightly as though to hold onto the contact. She looked up and found him watching her. Neither of them spoke. Rosalind stood and turned away to wash her hands, and when she turned back, Sebastian was writing on the slate. "Thank you." He left without staying for tea. The next day, a boy appeared at her cottage door. His name was Thomas, and he was 12 years old, bright-eyed and fatherless, with a cough that had lasted for 3 weeks. His mother had sent him to Rosalind with a note asking for a remedy. Rosalind examined him and found his lungs clear, but his throat inflamed. She made him a syrup of honey, thyme, and elderflower, and told him to take a spoonful 3 times a day. Thomas lingered in her kitchen, looking at the cages where the fox and the bird were recovering. He asked, "Did His Grace bring these?" She replied, "He did." Thomas said, "He brings all the hurt animals to you. He found a badger last year and kept it in the stable until its leg healed. He didn't tell anyone. I only knew because I sleep above the stalls." Rosalind glanced at the boy and asked, "You work in the stables?" He replied, "I'm the groom's apprentice. His Grace taught me to ride. He doesn't talk, but he's the best teacher I ever had. He shows you what to do, and if you do it wrong, he just waits until you figure it out." Rosalind handed him the bottle of syrup and said, "Take this home. Come back in a week if the cough hasn't improved." Thomas took the bottle and hesitated. He asked, "Are you going to leave?" Rosalind blinked and said, "What makes you think I'm leaving?" He replied, "Mrs. Harding said you got a letter from Thornfield. She said they want you to be their head herbalist." Rosalind had forgotten how quickly news traveled in a small village. She said, "I haven't decided." Thomas nodded slowly and said, "I hope you stay. His Grace likes you, I can tell." He left before Rosalind could ask him what he meant. Sebastian came to her cottage the next morning. He did not bring an injured animal. He simply knocked, and when she opened the door, he held out the slate. "May I come in?" Rosalind stepped back and let him enter. He sat at the table, and she made tea without asking. They sat quietly for a long moment, and then Sebastian wrote, "Thomas came to see you." She replied, "He did. He has a cough. I gave him a syrup." Sebastian nodded and wrote, "He is a good boy." She said, "He speaks highly of you." Sebastian's hand stilled on the slate. He did not write anything. Rosalind said, "He told me you taught him to ride." Sebastian nodded. She continued, "He also told me you bring injured animals to me because you trust me to care for them." Sebastian looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw something unguarded in his expression. Something that looked like gratitude, or perhaps loneliness, or perhaps both. He wrote, "I do trust you." Rosalind's chest tightened. She set down her cup and said, "The Thornfield letter came again. They want an answer." Sebastian's hand tightened on the chalk. He wrote, "What will you tell them?" She replied, "I don't know." He put down the chalk and did not write again that visit. 3 days later, Thomas fell from a horse. Rosalind was in her cottage when the stable boy came running, his face pale and his words tumbling over each other. He said, "Thomas fell, his arm. Please, miss, you have to come." She grabbed her bag and ran. The stable was dim and smelled of hay and leather. Thomas was on the ground near the mounting block, his face white with pain, his left arm bent at an angle that made Rosalind's stomach turn. Sebastian was kneeling beside him, one hand on the boy's shoulder. Rosalind knelt on Thomas's other side and examined the arm. The break was clean, just above the wrist, but the boy was shaking with shock and pain. She said, "I need to set it. It's going to hurt." Thomas nodded, his teeth clenched. Sebastian moved to hold the boy's shoulders, and Rosalind gripped Thomas's forearm. She counted to 3 and pulled. Thomas screamed, and Sebastian made a sound. It was low, involuntary, wrenched from his chest. A sound of anguish that had nothing to do with his own pain and everything to do with the boy's. It was not a word. It was not even a syllable. But it was vocal, and it was the first sound Sebastian Ashmore had made in 7 years. Rosalind's hand stilled. She looked up and met Sebastian's eyes across Thomas's body. His face was stricken, his mouth still open, and his hand was gripping Thomas's shoulder hard enough to leave marks. She finished setting the bone quietly and wrapped the arm in a splint. Thomas was crying softly, and Sebastian had not moved. When the splint was secure, Rosalind helped Thomas to his feet and sent him home with his mother, who had arrived moments after the bone was set. Then she turned to Sebastian, who was still kneeling on the stable floor. She crouched beside him and said, "You made a sound." He shook his head violently and stood, backing away from her. She said, "Sebastian, a sound is a beginning." He shook his head again and walked out of the stable. Rosalind did not follow him. That evening, Lady Ashmore summoned her to the great house. The drawing room was elegant and cold, decorated in shades of blue and silver. Lady Ashmore sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of beauty that age had refined rather than diminished. She said, "Miss Thorne, please sit." Rosalind sat. Lady Ashmore folded her hands in her lap and said, "I understand my son made a sound today." Rosalind nodded and replied, "He did." Lady Ashmore said, "And you believe this is a good thing?" Rosalind replied, "I do." Lady Ashmore's expression did not change. She said, "You are mistaken." Rosalind said nothing. Lady Ashmore continued, "7 years ago, my son lost his voice to illness. That is the story I have told, and it is the story this estate believes. But you are an intelligent woman, Miss Thorne. I think you have guessed that the truth is more complicated." Rosalind met her gaze and said, "I have." Lady Ashmore said, "Then you should also understand this. The man who spoke last was the man who shouted at his brother on a cliff edge. That is the voice waiting. If you make him speak, you make him remember why he stopped." Rosalind's hands tightened in her lap. She said, "You have kept him in a prison and called it protection." Lady Ashmore's eyes hardened. She said, "I have kept him alive." The quiet stretched between them. Then Rosalind said, "You lost one son. Are you willing to lose the other to silence?" Lady Ashmore replied, "I have not lost Sebastian. He is here. He manages the estate. He is present." Rosalind said, "He is not living. He is enduring." Lady Ashmore stood and said, "You may go, Miss Thorne. I have said what I came to say." Rosalind stood as well. She met Lady Ashmore's gaze and said, "I will not make him speak, but if he chooses to, I will not stop him." Lady Ashmore's expression did not change. She said, "Then you do not understand the cost." Rosalind left the great house and walked back to her cottage in the dark. When she arrived, she found the Thornfield letter on the table where she had left it. She picked up her pen, signed her name at the bottom, and sealed the envelope. The next morning, she posted the letter. The village responded as though she had announced a death. The blacksmith's wife came to her cottage in tears, asking who would set her daughter's bones if she fell again. The grocer's son arrived with a list of remedies his mother needed and asked if Rosalind could prepare them before she left. The tenants came in a steady stream, each one asking the same question: "Why are you leaving?" Rosalind answered them all the same way. She said, "Thornfield offered me a position. It is a good opportunity." No one believed her. Thomas came last. He stood in her doorway with his arm in a sling and said, "You're leaving because of me?" Rosalind blinked and asked, "What?" He said, "Because I fell. Because His Grace made that sound, and you think it's your fault." Rosalind said gently, "Thomas, I'm leaving because I was offered a better position. It has nothing to do with you." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. He said, "Then why does it feel like everything is breaking?" Rosalind had no answer for him. Sebastian disappeared for 3 days. No one knew where he had gone. Harding, the steward, delivered a note to Rosalind on the 2nd day. It was written on a slate in Sebastian's hand. "His Grace asks that deliveries be left at the kitchen door. He will not require." The sentence ended there. Rosalind took the slate from Harding and read the rest herself, written in smaller, shakier script. "She should not have to watch me be unable to speak." Harding said, "Those are not the words I would have chosen for him, miss." Rosalind held the slate. The handwriting was unsteady, as though Sebastian had written it quickly, or while his hand was shaking. She asked, "Where is he?" Harding replied, "I don't know, miss. He left on foot. He didn't take a horse." Rosalind returned the slate and said, "Thank you, Mr. Harding." Sebastian had gone to Hartwell Point. It was a place he had not visited in 7 years. A stretch of cliffs on the western edge of the estate, where the land dropped away to the sea. The cliffs were unstable, crumbling at the edges, and the county had lost 3 people to falls in the past decade. One of them had been Edmund Ashmore. Sebastian stood at the edge where his brother had fallen. The wind was cold, pulling at his coat, and the sea below was gray and restless. He opened his mouth. He tried to speak. Nothing came. He tried again. His jaw worked, his throat moved, but no sound emerged. The quiet was absolute, a wall he could not break through, and he realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the sound he had made in the stable had been involuntary. A crack in the architecture, not a door. He sat down on the ground where Edmund had died, and stayed there until the sun set. When he returned to the great house, Harding was waiting in the hall. Sebastian took the slate and wrote, "I am fine. Do not send anyone after me." Harding said, "Miss Thorne is leaving, Your Grace." Sebastian nodded. Harding continued, "She posted the letter to Thornfield 3 days ago. The cart comes tomorrow at dawn." Sebastian stared at the slate. Then he turned and walked to his study. Rosalind packed her belongings that evening. She folded her dresses, wrapped her father's medical texts in cloth, and placed her instruments in their case. The cottage felt smaller with everything packed, and she moved through the rooms as though saying goodbye to each one. She said goodbye to the tenants. She said goodbye to Thomas, who cried and then hugged her fiercely with his good arm. She said goodbye to Harding, who shook her hand and told her she would be missed. She did not say goodbye to Sebastian. The evening was cool and still, and Rosalind opened the cottage door for one last look at the garden she had planted. The rosemary was thriving, the yarrow had been harvested, and the blackthorn was bare but alive. And on the gravel path, standing where he had never stood at this hour, was Sebastian Ashmore. He was watching her with an expression she could not name. His hands were empty, no slate, no chalk, nothing to write with. He was simply there, wordless and still, and when she said, "The cart comes tomorrow," he said nothing. Rosalind felt her throat tighten. She turned to go inside. Behind her, a voice she had never heard, low, rough, and certain, spoke into the stillness. He said, "Ask me why." She stopped. Her hand was still on the doorframe, her body half turned toward the cottage. She turned back slowly and found him watching her, his mouth still open, his chest rising and falling, as though the words had cost him everything. He said again, "Ask me why." Rosalind's heart was pounding. She stepped down from the threshold and crossed the gravel path until she was standing in front of him. She said, Why did you stop speaking?" Sebastian's jaw tightened. He looked away, toward the cliffs in the distance, and then back at her. He said, "7 years ago, my brother Edmund rode to Hartwell Point. He was drunk, reckless, 22 years old, and convinced he was invincible. I followed him, found him at the edge of the cliffs, laughing, daring me to stop him." Rosalind did not move. He continued, "I shouted at him. I commanded him to step back. He turned toward my voice. The ground gave way. He fell." Rosalind's breath caught. Sebastian said, "My voice killed him. The authority in it, the command. That is what made him turn. If I had stayed silent, he would have stepped back on his own. But I shouted, and he died." Rosalind said, "It was not your voice. It was the ground." He replied, "I know that. Rationally, I know. But my body remembers. I opened my mouth, I spoke, and my brother fell. I have not spoken since, because I could not trust my voice not to cause harm again." Rosalind took a step closer and asked, "Why are you speaking now?" Sebastian met her eyes and said, "Because you are leaving, and I cannot let the same instinct that cost me Edmund cost me you." Rosalind's hands were shaking. She reached out and took the front of his coat, the same coat he had placed over her shoulders in the rain, and pulled gently. She said, "Come inside." Sebastian stepped forward. He crossed the threshold, and Rosalind closed the door behind him. They stood in the dim light of the cottage, and Rosalind said, "You did not kill your brother." Sebastian replied, "I know." She said, "Say it again. Say it until you believe it." Sebastian's voice cracked. He said, "I did not kill my brother." She said, "Again." He said, "I did not kill Edmund." Rosalind stepped closer and placed her hands on either side of his face. She said, "You have been silent for 7 years because you believed your voice was dangerous. But your voice is not dangerous, Sebastian. It is the first thing you have given me that I did not have to ask for." Sebastian's hands came up to cover hers. He said, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to speak and live at the same time." Rosalind said, "Then learn. I will help you." Sebastian leaned down and kissed her. It was slow, tentative, the kiss of a man who had not trusted any part of himself to make contact in 7 years. Rosalind's hands slid from his face to the back of his neck, and she pulled him closer. His arms came around her, and the coat she was still holding fell between them like a question answered. When they finally pulled apart, Sebastian said, "Don't go to Thornfield." Rosalind smiled and replied, "I won't." He said, "Stay here. Stay with me." She replied, "I will, but you have to promise me something." He said, "Anything." She said, "You have to go back to the cliffs, and you have to speak Edmund's name aloud, not to punish yourself, to remember him." Sebastian's hands tightened on her waist. He said, "I don't know if I can." Rosalind said, "You can, and I will be with you." 6 months later, the herb garden bloomed in the early light of dawn. Rosalind was sitting on the bench outside her cottage, bundling chamomile, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She looked up and saw Sebastian walking toward her, a cutting in his hand. He stopped at the bench and held it out. He said, "Yarrow, you said you needed it last Tuesday." Rosalind took the cutting and smiled. She said, "You remembered." Sebastian replied, "I remember everything you said, all of it." Rosalind set down the chamomile and stood. She asked, "Walk with me?" Sebastian asked, "Where?" She replied, "Hartwell Point." Sebastian hesitated, then nodded. He said, "All right." They walked together through the fields, past the tenant farms and the oak trees, to the cliffs on the western edge of the estate. Thomas ran ahead of them, his arm healed and his energy boundless. He had moved into the great house 3 months ago, after Lady Ashmore had finally told him the truth, that Edmund had been his father, and that Sebastian had been looking after him all these years. When they reached the cliffs, Thomas ran to the edge and threw stones at the sea. Sebastian stood where Edmund had fallen and looked out at the water. Rosalind stood beside him and took his hand. Sebastian said, "Edmund." The word was carried away by the wind, but it was spoken, and it was enough. Thomas turned and called, "Who is Edmund?" Sebastian looked at Rosalind, and she nodded. He turned to Thomas and said, "Your father. I will tell you about him." Thomas ran back to them, his face bright with curiosity, and the three of them walked back from the cliffs together. The wind was at their backs, and the morning was clear, and for the first time in 7 years, Sebastian Ashmore was speaking. At the great house window, Lady Ashmore watched her son walk the cliff path with Rosalind and Thomas. She saw him stop, saw him speak, saw the boy respond. She sat down slowly in the chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, and closed her eyes. 7 years of standing guard was finished. In the herb garden, Rosalind and Sebastian sat together on the bench where their lives had first intersected. She handed him a yarrow cutting to hold while she worked, and he held it without question, his presence steady and sure. The hush between them was no longer a wall. It was a choice, one they could make together, or not, as they wished. And when Sebastian spoke, his voice was no longer rough or uncertain. It was simply his own. He said, "I love you." Rosalind looked up from her work and smiled. She said, "I know. You've been showing me for months." Sebastian said, "I wanted to say it." Rosalind said, "Then say it again." Sebastian leaned down and kissed her. He said, "I love you." She replied, "I love you too." And in the garden where the rosemary grew and the yarrow bloomed, two people who had accepted solitude as permanent discovered that solitude had been preparation, not destination. They had found each other in the quiet, and now, in the speaking, they would build a life together.